Mohon semua peserta kembali ke dalam dewan kerana sesi yang seterusnya akan dimulakan sebentar lagi. I would like to invite all guests to come back as the session will start in a few minutes. Sebelum sesi seterusnya dijalankan, ada sedikit pemakluman. Di atas meja para hadirin sekalian terdapat satu jemputan edaran. Pihak Parlimen telah meletakkan satu edaran jemputan, iaitu kalau semua ada ya, semua dia. Is Speakers Lecture Series, Parliament and Civil Society, The Voice of the Rakyat, by Yang Amat Mulia Tunku Zain Al-Abidin Ibni Tunku Mukris. So basically this is an invitation. Sesiapa yang berminat bolehlah mendaftar dan menyerahkan borang kehadiran kepada pihak urustia Parlimen. The Secretariat has distributed an invitation on your table. It is an invitation to a program which will be carried on the 12th of December. Those interested to join, please indicate your interest by letting the Secretariat know. Thank you. ahli-ahli yang berhormat, div-div kehormat dan semua tetamu yang dihormati sekalian. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Selamat kembali ke sesi 3 pada petang ini. Majlis diteruskan lagi dengan pembentangan yang bertajuk Sistem Jawatankuasa Pilihan Parlimen. Moderator bagi sesi ini ialah Yang Berhormat Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah. Dan pembentangnya adalah The Honourable Kevin Andrews, Father of the Australian House of Representatives. Welcome back to the third session entitled The Parliamentary Select Committee System. I would like to invite the Honourable Kevin Andrews and Honourable Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah as the moderator to begin the session. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. This is quite a unique place I am standing. I used to be there, I used to be out, and I used to be there again. Now I'm right in the middle. I hope this is a good omen and a good beginning. Anyway, welcome back to the session. Now that I'm here, no one can say that I went to another rally somewhere else. I wish to congratulate the organizers, in particular IDE, for organizing this seminar together with, of course, the Speaker of the House. Let me welcome our speaker for this session, Honorable Mr. Kevin Andrew. The topic for this afternoon is specifically on the select committees or the formation of the select committees in Parliament. This is, of course, part and parcel of the reform of the parliamentary system. We have been discussing quite a bit on how do we make our parliament more people-centered. There have been papers prepared, there have been seminars conducted in the past, but I think at this moment, in particular because I happen to be the Chief Secretary of Pakatan Harapan, I wish to put on record that in our manifesto, when we stated very clearly that we are for the reform of Parliament, that some of the ideas were actually gathered from a proposal which was proposed by, from a paper which was proposed by a parliamentary reform proposal group, I think back in 2015, and it was chaired by Abdullah, who is now a member of Parliament. That group comprises several CSOs, for example, Bersih, Engage, Ideas, Political Studies for Change, KPRU, ProHam. I see a former ProHam Sekjen here, Denison. Project Beres, Tindak Malaysia, Undi Malaysia, and it was supported by the Bar Council and the Global Movement of Moderate. Now I remember I was the CEO of the GMM at that time, the good GMM, if I may. But of course, a people-centered parliament, one premium element of a people-centered parliament is, of course, the select committees. I think the Speaker have already announced the formation of 6 select committees that we have never had before, plus 1 caucus. They are all bipartisan. But beyond that, though this may not be necessarily discussed in this session, and definitely not in this session, but probably in the other sessions afterward and beyond, is of course law reform by itself. And by law reform, I mean the need for us to actually come up with a law reform commission comprising senior law, the eminent law personalities in the country. It could be a former judge, a former, at least you can go on, former judges, former professors, or sitting professors. And this is, of course, to look at the laws that we have, what are the ones that we need to repeal. It's already there in the manifesto, but probably having a law reform commission could be a proper way of doing it and report it. Or it could be another select committee at the parliament. These are law reform commission is one way of doing it, but a select committee is another way of doing it, because we have a list of laws that we want to repeal, that we want to amend, and we may also want to introduce one or two new laws. And the other aspect of law reform is, of course, public consultation in lawmaking processes. The example that I'm going to use may not be the best. Probably Australia has a better example, but I'm using Denmark as an example, where there is a proper guideline as to how the lawmaking process is very participatory, comprising several steps, like for example, from the concept stage to discussion by a committee of relevant stakeholders, to public consultation, to cabinet decision, to private bill, to final draft of the bill by the AG, to select committee discussion, and then finally the minister takes it to the floor. This is one country that I know of. There may be others, as I said, but this is one country that I know of that actually have a proper guideline as to how laws are being made, and there are ample opportunities for the public to actually participate in the law-making process. In our case, there was an experiment during the previous administration, but it was not because the previous administration wanted to do it, but because there were three gentlemen who were a little mischievous, and they were Mujahid and Saifuddin and Chiwi. We were drafting the National Harmony Act, if you remember. So we had the draft with the assistance of the Bar Council, and then we went public, and then all of us got shot from left and right, except for most people who are present in this hall today. They were those few who were giving very positive feedbacks. Oh, this is a good way of doing law reform. So it was really an experiment. But I must also give credit to another process that was taken by the previous administration. And this was when they come up with when they were, I think they were amending, Datuk Rosmi is here, you can vouch for me. When they were discussing the amendment to the Constitution on the women, something to do with the women, I think. There was a lot of consultation. It's not the act, but I think it was after it was after the government at that time decided to rectify CEDAW, and there were a lot of consultation. I wish I can name the minister, but I'm not so sure which one. Was it Zahara? Was it Sharizad? See, I'm very non-partisan. Yang bagus-bagus lah. But there was a good. I thought that was also a good experiment where we didn't have Kevin at that time. We didn't have a select committee. All I'm trying to share is that there were efforts in the past by civil society organization and by some parliamentarians actually to consult stakeholders as if we have a select committee, but we don't at that moment in time. Now, Mr. Kevin Andrews is known as the father of the Australian House of Representatives. He was complaining, he's very young to be called a father. He was elected to the House of Representatives for Menzies, Victoria, in 1991, and has been re-elected wow, 93, 96, 98, 2001, 2004, 2007, 2010, 2013, and 2016, and next year? Hopefully. So guys, if you want to study how to be re-elected, here's the guy. Previously, he served in the Harvard government as the Minister for Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, and then also as the Minister for Immigration and Citizenship. He is the longest continuously serving member of the House of Representatives. Brothers and sisters, let's welcome Mr. Kevin Andrews.
Foreign Minister, Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, His Excellency the Australian High Commissioner to Malaysia, distinguished members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen all, thank you very much for this kind invitation to participate in this important seminar, which of course comes at an important time for reform here in your nation. I note that in passing, Foreign Minister, that 61 years is a mark of a long period for change. Back in my country, we're having trouble keeping a Prime Minister for 61 weeks. But I bring with me the greetings of the Speaker, my friend, the Honourable Tony Smith. Mr. Speaker, and a delegation went to Australia in September, and it was as a result of the discussions there that I come to be here today at the request of our Speaker of the Australian Parliament. And I'm delighted to be back in Malaysia again. The last time I was here was in 2015, when I was then the Defence Minister for Australia. I should say that we have a very warm relationship with Malaysia. We have a strong economic rapport with this country and trade. We also, of course, are part of a very important strategic security arrangement of which Malaysia is a part. And increasingly, Australians are coming to Malaysia to visit, to holiday, to be in this country. And of course, so many young Malaysians have been to Australia for education. I think more than 300,000 now Malaysians have studied in Australia. We had the opportunity with the High Commission last night to have the Australian Malaysian Alumni Awards, and about 400 of those Malaysians who had studied in Australia were there last night, and it was a very wonderful gathering of people who, through that personal relationship, helped to build the rapport between the peoples of our two countries. My remarks today are made in the context of, obviously, the promise by the current government to restore the dignity of Parliament, part of the manifesto that you, Foreign Minister, talked about in your opening remarks, a major component of which involves the creation of a series of parliamentary committees. Now, I should say that whilst I will draw on my experience of more than 27 years in the Australian Parliament, there is an important qualification. There is much in common in the background and history of our respective systems of government, but there are also differences. And I do not pretend this afternoon to suggest that our experience in Australia is universally applicable. Rather, I offer some observations by which you can make a comparison about your own circumstances, aspirations and requirements here in Malaysia. So let me start with a brief description of the Australian parliamentary committees. Although the Australian Parliament has existed since the federation of the then colonies, from states now, into the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, the committee system is of more recent origin. In 1970, the Senate appointed 7 legislative and general purpose standing committees and 5 estimates committees. The House of Representatives subsequently established a system of general purpose standing committees in 1987. The new standing committees, together with the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence, provided the House with the instruments to inquire into and to report on the whole range of government activity. There are broadly 6 types of committees in the Australian Parliament. The first are the general purpose committees in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Examples include committees relating to agriculture and water, to economics, to social policy and legal affairs, and health and aged care and sport. These committees may also examine bills referred to them in a similar manner to the select committees recently announced here in Malaysia. Secondly, there are domestic committees which address the procedures, processes and services of the Parliament, such as the Procedures Committee, the Privileges and Members' Interests Committee and the Library Committee. These are similar to your selection, standing orders, House and Privileges Committees in the Malaysian Parliament. Thirdly, there are the joint House and Senate statutory committees which are established by legislation. Examples include the Public Accounts and Audit Committee and the Public Works Committee. I note that the Malaysian Parliament also has an equivalent Public Accounts Committee. Fourth, there are joint standing committees. These committees are established by the resolution of both chambers of the Parliament. Examples include the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade and the Joint Standing Committee on the National Disability Insurance Scheme. These committees comprise both members from the House of Representatives and members from the Senate and represent the range of parties within the Parliament overall. Fifth, there are joint select committees established by the resolution, also of both houses, that essentially address a short-term issue. These are short-term in the work which they do rather than the standing committees which go on and address a range of issues. So an example in the current Australian Parliament is the committee which has been examining the constitutional recognition for Indigenous people. The committee tabled its final report just in the past week and therefore has concluded its work. And finally, the Senate has estimates committees that examine the budgets of the various government departments and agencies 3 times a year. In May, June, after the budget is delivered, in August, and then in the beginning of early in the year, there's a supplementary budget estimates process. Now, having indicated the different types of committees in Australia, I should stress that there's no particular reason why there are different types of committees. The differences are more the result of historic decisions. For example, why there is a standing committee or why there is a select committee. But because of historic decisions over the past, the reality is that we have these 6 different types of committees. But what's important is that combined, every activity of the Australian government is subject to examination, discussion and report upon by at least one parliamentary committee. So having described the committee system in broad, let me turn then to the purpose and value of parliamentary committees before providing a number of examples about the impact of some of the committees. There are many advantages, I submit, in a vibrant committee system. It allows for the in-depth examination of issues by members of Parliament and greater input by the community, scholars, experts and groups representing the various interests in the nation. There is a deep scepticism in Australia, in some cases cynicism, about the political process, and that's shared in many countries if we look around the world at the present time. The work of committees can help bridge the divide between the formal institutional structures of the Parliament and the community. Hence, many Australian parliamentary committees conduct hearings and discussions in all different parts of the country, going directly out to the people rather than expecting the people will come to the Parliament. Most people, at least in Australia, do not join political parties, but many do join community and other organisations. And by providing a means for discussion with these organisations, parliamentary committees again help to bridge the formal divide, bringing the work of the legislature closer to the people by listening to their concerns and issues in a format designed to work towards solutions. This, in turn, assists members of Parliament and their parties to maintain a rapport with their constituents. As the Australian scholar Professor Ian Marsh has written, and I quote, "Elections create governments and clothe them with authority, but it is not a durable authority. Particularly in these days when citizens are much more informed about politics and much more engaged, it is much more important to create that ongoing link between citizens and the community." Unquote. It's also been my experience that committees are more likely to build a consensus about policy solutions to the various challenges facing the country. As the House Procedure Committee observed in a report on the work of committees, historically, House committees have been focused on working cooperatively to formulate constructive solutions to public policy problems. Committees can take a longer-term assessment of the issues before them, free from the usual political posturing that goes on in chambers like this, I suspect, in Malaysia as it does in Australia. Democracy depends on accountability, which is aided by transparency. How and why are public funds expended? How are decisions reached? And so forth. The Public Accounts and Audit Committee and the Public Works Committee, two of the long-standing committees in the Australian Parliament, serve this function in particular, as do the Senate Estimates Committee, which examine the budgets of government departments and statutory agencies. The committee process has also evolved in recent years to include regular discussions with senior public officials and oversight of significant national agencies. Hence, the House Economics Committee has regular private and public briefings and hearings with the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. And these are televised, and all Australians can look at the discussion between the members of the Public Accounts Committee and the Governor of the Reserve Bank, particularly about monetary policy into the future and his views about changes that might be occurring. Similarly, the National Disability Insurance Committee, which I chair, regularly questions ministers, senior officials from the National Disability Insurance Agency and senior public servants responsible for the administration of the scheme. Committees also provide members of Parliament with many opportunities to receive private briefings. The Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, for example, has numerous briefings every week from Defence and Foreign Affairs officials, the senior leadership of the Australian Defence Forces, ambassadors, both our own who are serving overseas when they return for their yearly visit, or foreign ambassadors. For example, we've had the Malaysian ambassador or High Commissioner to Australia come and discuss matters in terms of the relationship between Australia and Malaysia from a security and defence and economic perspective, and also representatives of other foreign governments visiting delegations and non-government organisations. So this gives an opportunity on a bipartisan basis for members of the committee to have these discussions, which in turn informs the work which we do and the way in which we seek to represent the people of Australia in the National Parliament. So let me then illustrate my observations with a number of case studies. They illustrate how the work of a committee can assist the development of policy, especially about contentious issues. The first involves the troubling issue of divorce and separation, which often has a detrimental impact on former spouses and their children. Soon after my election to Parliament in 1991, I was appointed to a select committee to inquire into the operation of the Child Support Scheme, a statutory scheme which was put in place to ensure that payments are made for children post-separation. Indeed, under the court system that operated prior to that in Australia, financial support for children of separated parents had virtually become a voluntary payment. The average amount paid was very little, and many former spouses didn't contribute at all to the ongoing support and upbringing of their children post-separation. Faced with a barrage of complaints about child support, the Parliament asked the committee to examine the operation of the new child support scheme. The committee received more than 6,000 submissions from members of the public, the largest number then of any inquiry ever conducted by the Australian Parliament, and more than 150,000 attempts were made on a special telephone hotline to contact the committee and for people to provide their experiences of what was working or not working in many cases so far as child support was concerned. The cross-party committee agreed that there were inequities that should be remedied, but within an hour of the release of the report, the then Minister categorically ruled out any substantial change. Apart from the substantive issues involved, the curt response was unproductive, and it was part of the reason I believe that child support continued to remain a political issue for so long in Australia. The issues had not been resolved when the Howard government was elected in 1996. On regular occasions, government MPs would raise the issue, and as a consequence further inquiries were established, including one I chaired in 1998 and another, a breakthrough report in 2003 entitled Every Picture Tells a Story. The committee heard from thousands of Australians before drafting that 2003 report. The recommendations from that report, as distinct from the one in the early 90s, were adopted by the government and became the basis of the new Family Dispute Resolution Program and changes to the child support arrangements in Australia. The fact that the committee members had been able to agree on changes in a very contentious area of social policy enabled the Parliament to make significant changes to the system that had been operating prior to then. Moreover, these changes resolved many of the problems that separating parents and their children experienced, and those changes, which were legislated and put into programs in the early 2000s, essentially remain the basis of the child support and the family resolution system in Australia since then, and the level of complaint about that has diminished very substantially as a result of the changes being made. So I use that as an example in the first place of where a committee had come to an agreement, but it was rejected by the government and the problems continued. When finally the government adopted the recommendations that a bipartisan committee had made a decade later, it largely resolved the problems that we were facing in this area in Australia. Let me turn then to another case example involving the contentious issue of human cloning and stem cell research. The advent of research into human cloning in the 1990s was a matter of considerable controversy in Australia. There was very little regulation and great contention about the ethics of various practices. As a consequence, the Parliament asked the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which I then chaired, to examine the issue. It was unsurprising that the diversity of opinion in the community over the use of embryos in cloning research for the derivation of embryonic stem cells or other purposes was reflected amongst committee members. While all members agreed that embryos should not be specifically created for research, the question of whether existing embryonic stem cells could be used for therapeutic use divided the committee. And the challenge, therefore, was how to civilly reflect these differences and yet agree upon a regulatory scheme for Australia. This we did by recording the different opinions on the sensitive issue in an otherwise unanimous report. And as a consequence, the scheme of regulation and legislation, which the committee could unanimously agree upon, became the basis for the law in Australia, which exists with some modifications, obviously, because of different changes in practice up to this date. Other examples of committee reports having a significant impact on government policy and legislation include a Ships of Shame report on maritime shipping and another one, the Blame Game, which referred to aspects of health funding at the present time. These reports, I should say, can be found on the Australian Parliamentary website and examples of where committees have unanimously come together. Having illustrated a number of examples where the work of a parliamentary committee shaped government policy, programs and legislation, let me refer to a case where a failure to adopt the recommendations compounded the problem. Those who have followed Australian politics in recent years will be aware that the question of whether certain members and senators have been constitutionally eligible to sit in the Parliament has been a controversial issue. A number of members and senators have been ruled ineligible by Australia's High Court because they are found to have retained an allegiance to a foreign country. This was because the person concerned, or a parent, or in some cases even a grandparent, had citizenship of another nation, sometimes unbeknown to the member or senator concerned. But nonetheless, the High Court has found in some cases those people to be ineligible to sit in the Australian Parliament. A committee I chaired in 1998 recommended that the constitutional provisions in question, having been enacted more than a century earlier, did not accord with the contemporary situation in Australia, to which large numbers of people had migrated since the Second World War, many of whom had dual citizenship. The recommendations were accepted by the then government of Prime Minister Howard, but they were never implemented. As a consequence, the problem remains 20 years later, with a number of parliamentarians, as I said, being found ineligible by the High Court in recent years to sit in the Parliament. Had the recommendations, which were accepted but never implemented, been implemented back in the late 1990s, then some of the problems we're facing in terms of this issue would have been averted. Let me then make some further reflections on the subject. I believe the role of the committee chair is critical to the success of a parliamentary committee. An enthusiastic, committed chairperson who can work with members from different parties in a cooperative manner is more likely to succeed. An emphasis on policy rather than politics is critical if cross-party committees are to find commonly accepted solutions to the issues before them. As a committee chair, I always strive to reach conclusions and make recommendations that all members of the committee, regardless of their political party, can subscribe to. If a committee is divided, the government can simply dismiss any proposals from it, saying, you know, half the people thought that and half the members thought that, so it's too hard and we don't have to do anything. That's more difficult for a government if you have a unanimous report on a bipartisan basis from a parliamentary committee. In Australia, a parliamentary committee is independent of the executive government. As a minister, in fact, I welcome the work of parliamentary committees because a unanimous report from a committee that was drawn from the various parties in the parliament signalled to me that there was an agreement on the policy response to the issues that the committee had considered. Accordingly, it was easier for the government to implement the policy and program changes which had been suggested by the committee. We've also been blessed in Australia by having highly competent research staff for our parliamentary committees. Their efforts, assisted by the work of the Parliamentary Library research staff, add considerably to the quality of committee reports. Members of Parliament, at least in Australia, tend to be generalists. We know a little about a myriad of subjects. Most of us develop some specialist knowledge in a few subjects, but rely on experts in many other policy areas. Hence, the research staff of our committee is critical to the quality of our work, as is the ability on occasions to second experts, might be in academics. In the case of the human cloning report, it was a scientist who worked in that area. In other areas, we've seconded experts in from academia to assist with the work of the committee in particular inquiries, and that helps the quality of the output of the committee. Finally, a periodic review of the work of committees, such as undertaken by the Australian House Committee on Procedure, is desirable, both to ensure the committee system is operating as effectively as possible and achieving the aspirations of both Parliament and the people. Whilst our committee system is well structured now, the reality is it's just over 20 years old. In most of the life of the Australian Parliament, there were very few committees, very few members of Parliament up until the 1970s actually ever served on a committee, yet if you look at it now, it's a much different structure. We have evolved, and I believe we will continue to evolve in terms of how we can ensure that the Parliament best responds to the people of Australia and the issues that are concerning them. The work of committees enhances the purpose of Parliament to consider the views of all Australians and best respond to them. This involves a long-term view about how to create, sustain and enhance our institutional arrangements. The enhanced committee system is therefore, I believe, a nation-building exercise. Our committee system has continued to evolve, as I said. Public submissions are encouraged. Hearings are held in public and often broadcast via the Parliamentary broadcast channel. Reports are published in the Parliament, and the government is required to respond with reasons as to why it accepts or doesn't accept the recommendations made in the report, and that in turn is published on the Parliament's website as well. So there's a degree of transparency not just in what the committee has recommended, but the response of the government to the report and the recommendations of each of the committee. And as I said, that enhances transparency, and then finally the committee reports can be debated in the Parliament, so there's an opportunity for members, especially through our second or parallel chamber, to have the opportunity to debate what it is that the committees have recommended to the Parliament and make their views known to the government and to the Minister of the day. So thank you again for the honour of being able to participate in this important seminar at this significant time in the parliamentary life of this nation. I wish you well in your endeavours to best represent the wishes and the interests of the people of Malaysia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Andrews, for your very enlightening presentation. We have time for Q&A. I know we have time for Q&A, but I need to be guided until what time? Until? We have 20 minutes. Okay, so we have 20 minutes. So, yep. So let's make full use of these 20 minutes, brothers and sisters. I see a hand there, and then I'll go to you, sir, and then Aslam. Yeah, sila. Yes, Ali Muhammad.
Hello, sir. My name is Ahmad Aktifanus, and I'm an RMIT University alumni. And I was living in Australia for about 6 years. To complete my studies for 4 years, mechanical engineers for 2 years. And I do pay a lot of taxes to Australian government.
Good Malaysian citizen.
And my question is, how do you maintain your political, in your opinion, how do you maintain your political stability, even though you keep on changing your government and also keep changing your prime minister? Or I never felt the instability, I don't know. But my second question is regarding, because you are the former immigration minister, how do you see the keep on changing of the immigration policies in Australia? Because I think over these past years and been changes a lot. That's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, I will invite Mr. Andrew to reply to that. But if I may, the next questions, can we confine the questions to the presentation to the select committees or committees of the Parliament? Okay, Andrew would prefer if we take more questions. So yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, YB. I'm Ong from Business Ethics Institute of Malaysia again. So question to Your Excellency, Kevin. So you have several select committees, yeah, to YB's point. But however, you also mentioned that there is generally a rise in political cynicism. So how do you keep the Parliament relevant, and how do you sustain the reputation of the Parliament? Allow me the second question, because I've been wanting to ask this question. Datuk Speaker from Malacca has been talking about parliamentary culture, kebudayaan di Parliament. Yeah. So this is the first time I have stepped into this hall. I felt that it is too majestic for a policy-making platform. I find that there are a lot of walls separating the MPs. Not sure what is your opinion in terms of the structure. You know, is it more conducive to have less wall to promote collaboration among the MPs, linked to the select committees, bipartisan functioning, and so on? Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Aslam.
Thank you very much, Datuk. I actually want to focus on an area that Datuk Saifuddin mentioned about the consultation before something reaches maybe the select committee. A few years ago, and I think Datuk Saifuddin was actually the Deputy Minister at that time, the AUKU was amended, the University and University Colleges Act was amended. And I was representing Academic Staff Association of the university, and we had meetings with all academic staff associations. We spent many days coming up with what we thought were important reforms. At the end of the day, the one who drafted the reforms that we had suggested left out maybe 95% of what we had put. So I'm just wondering, in the case of Australia and maybe in other countries, how do you ensure that the voices of interested parties are actually taken into consideration when, you know, laws are discussed in Parliament and so on? Thank you.
Those questions. To my friend from RMIT, I suppose I should have said good day. Can I start with the last question, because I remember the answer to that first, in terms of the consultation, and how do you ensure that all the matters that are put to the committee or put to the organisation are reflected in any report or any recommendations from the committee? The way in which that is largely achieved is that because we try to find a consensus. We go out and seek the views of people who have different ideas about what the subject might be. Let me just give an example. On the National Disability Scheme, looking at different aspects of that, we specifically invite disability advocacy groups, we invite people in the allied health profession, we invite people that have some range of interest in this issue to make a submission to the committee and to come along and actually have a discussion with the committee. And then the other thing we've been doing where we have those discussions, for example, in the day's hearing might be in Adelaide or Perth or somewhere around Australia, when we have those groups in for the formal hearing and discussion in the morning, we then spend a couple of hours in the afternoon inviting any member of the public who has an interest in the subject to come along and tell us their experiences. And we try to limit them to 5-minute contributions so we can get through as many people as possible. And that's essentially a listening exercise on the part of the committee. The only time we speak is to try and clarify what the point is that the person might be making to us. So there are a variety of ways which I think you can try and ensure that. But if the committee is a bipartisan committee and the objective of the committee is to try and reach a consensus about what all can agree, then I don't think you run a great risk of missing things because it's just the agenda of one particular person who happens to chair the committee. That's why I said in my remarks that I believe that the role of the chairperson is critical to the success of the committees. But having said that, it's very rare in Australia for committees not to actually reach a consensus about the issues that they're talking about. Sometimes on a bill, it might not be because there'll be a different view between the political parties about a bill, but on a general inquiry into some public policy issue, then invariably Australian parliamentary committees come to a consensus set of recommendations, and that works in that regard. The other questions, cynicism. How do you deal with cynicism? It's there in the political process. That's true, and when people in Australia see politicians sort of shouting at each other in what we call question time, that doesn't aid it, and that's about all that's shown on television. But you can overcome it by the committee work because the committees go directly out to people and it shows another aspect of the way in which the Parliament operates. People come along to a committee and find that the committee members don't seem to be having a difference between each other. They're all trying to find a solution to a particular problem. And I think that experience and the fact that we try to go out to the people rather than them coming to us all the time, I think at least ameliorates some of that cynicism that exists. Does it entirely overcome it? No, it doesn't. It would be silly to claim otherwise, but at least it shows the Parliament working in a way which is much more constructive than what people might see on the news reports on television in the evening. The question about immigration policies and I'm trying to read my own writing. The stability within the system in Australia. Look, even though we've changed a few prime ministers over the last few years, the system has remained fairly stable, and that's because I think the institutional arrangements are firm. Yes, the Labor Party changed their prime minister twice. Now we on our side have changed our prime minister twice, but the government has continued to operate until the next election at least has come round and the people make a verdict on the government at that stage. So I think my observation is stability of government comes from stability of institutional arrangements which can cope with changes that occur from time to time in terms of who happens, for example, to be the Prime Minister or leading the government.
I've just been informed that we actually have time until 4, so we still have about 40 minutes. So can I welcome question? Yes, Yang Berhormat, followed by Denison and the gentleman at the far back. Okay, YB.
I'm Dr. Nulela from Adun Penanti, or State Legislator in Penang. My question is, do you have instances in Australia where the backbenchers have submitted a lot of motions for the government or at the state level to create select committees, but it never happens. I mean, we submitted motions or whatever, but it's like it falls into deaf ears. But we do realize in Penang that Selangor has a lot of select committees, and it has worked. And the reason being, it was said, is because, oh, we already have the executive. Why do we need select committees? How do you, is it possible for, say, the Malaysian Parliament to tell the state that, you know, if the backbenchers have proposed a motion to hold select committees, then the state executives should look into the motions that has been submitted. Thank you.
Thank you, YB. Dennison.
Dennison, thank you for the presentation. You were given a difficult afternoon to present it. And I also find a comment about parliamentary reform and the kind of seating that we have here doesn't seem very conducive. It makes you actually go to sleep. So that's something they might want to look at in terms of type of seating and the tempo. But that's not for you, Honorable Kevin. My question is with regards to the committees that you highlighted in terms of its purpose. And I noted in purpose 3 and 4, building consensus, as well as the committees taking a long-term view of it. My basic understanding of how parliamentary sessions here go, I'm sure it would be similar there, is that they are actually working towards taking over government, and so it is party politics, it's trying to outshine the other, and it's to make sure that the government is wrong or they are right, and they don't want to solve the problem collectively. So how does that actually work out in a way that party interest is not dominant, but that national interest? And in that sense, that is linked to my second part. In terms of select committees, I think in some of the committees in the past, they have worked quite effectively in the kind of reports they have produced here. But it's also the independence of the Member of Parliament. It's actually culture, whether Australians are by nature more independent and would stand up to their leaders, but parliamentarians very obligated to their party leaders and their representatives in the cabinet, to the Prime Minister, to be able to really scrutinize a minister and put it. So to what extent does culture, the competencies, the kind of parliamentary structure or legislation enable them to play, really play that role, to question their colleagues within the political system? And how is it within Australia you have managed to, from the various examples that you are citing, and what pointers can we look at? If not, the committees could also become just points to reaffirm what the cabinet wants, or the backbenchers don't become agents of the cabinet in the parliament, but would really hold the cabinet accountable in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennison. Yeah, Sadara.
Good afternoon. My name is Maizul from Malacca, one of the southern states in the peninsula. Can you share with us from your experience in Australia? Because as we understand it, in the context of Malaysia, at the federal level, we have a few select committees. And then on the other hand, we also have audit committee, also anti-corruption agency. And that is, I look at it horizontal, while vertically at the state level, also like what YB Dr. Nolela mentioned, some states also already have set up committees. Also at the state level, they have this maybe perhaps audit committee at the state level. So can you share with us in Australian context how these relationships takes place horizontally and vertically? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I deal with that last question, which related to the first one as well in terms of the states? In Australia, each of the state parliaments have a similar committee system to what we have in the national parliament. So it's replicated at the state and territory level, and those committees, from my observation, work quite effectively in the state and territory parliaments as well. I can't advise you how you can bring that about in states in Malaysia, except that I'd say that if a state sees that the national parliamentary committee system is working well, then I think people will want to have that system themselves, because it brings about better policy outcomes, better program outcomes, and hopefully better legislation, whether it's at the national level or the state level. So I think putting it in place and having it work effectively becomes a model, if you like, for others in terms of what they might do in other parts of the country. And that, in a sense, leads to the other question, which was about how do you overcome preferment? How do you ensure that there is some degree of independence from the executive by the parliamentary committee? Why doesn't it simply become we were right and they were wrong type of exercise at the parliamentary committee level? And I should say that this is in the context of a quite strict party discipline system in Australia. We have a three-line whip essentially for every piece of legislation in Australia. For someone to cross the floor is a major issue in our country. There's not pieces of legislation where you can make up your own mind. The parties largely determine the outcome. So you've got that strict party system when it comes to voting in the chamber, and yet you've got a system of committees where people can work cooperatively together in order to arrive at a solution. Part of the reason is because I suspect that government changes regularly, and even if you're in opposition, you know that if this is a problem facing the nation, if it's not our problem as the government now, it's going to be our problem after the next election or the following election, and we're going to have to solve it. And that's realistically the attitude which is taken by members of parliament. They're working on committees. So we can say, regardless of our differences politically about issues, this is a challenge which the country has, and we need to solve this problem. And so we can work together cooperatively solve it, knowing that even if my party is in government now or my party's in opposition, that's going to change at some stage. The problem's going to still be there if we haven't solved it, and so it'll become our problem rather than the government of the day's problem. And I think it's that attitude, which is just a very practical attitude in relation to the challenges before the parliamentary committees, which is the motivating factor for most members of committees to actually come to solutions that will work. And after all, I mean, people may be, taken, to use Disraeli's expression, of climbing the greasy pole in politics, but the reality is, my observation is that members of parliament are actually there because they want to do the best they can for their country and for their constituents. They have different ideas about how you do that, but I think most members of parliament are genuine in their concern to do the best they can for their constituents and for their country. And if that's the underlying motivating factor, then you can work together to solve problems. And often that stops those problems becoming political issues where there's a divide between the two parties or the political groups as to how you resolve it. So it is largely, I suppose, about the culture. There is an independent streak, I suppose, in Australia as well. As a minister, I would never have thought to instruct a committee or a committee chairman what to do, because I would have been told what to do myself had I done that. And as a committee chair, I don't take instructions now from ministers as to what I should do on my committee. So there is that sense of independence and a sense of the executive and the legislature are different. Yes, we're drawn from the executives drawn from the legislature in Australia, but nonetheless there is a streak of independence, if you like, for parliamentary committees, which has been observed largely on both sides of politics for a long period of time.
Can I have some more questions, please? I saw some hands this side. Saudara, and then after that, YB Siva. Yeah, please.
Hello,
I saw another hand just now at the back. Okay, I'll take you together.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Salami from the Speaker Office, State Selangor Legislative Assembly. Okay, my question to the Honourable. How independent the select committee from the executive body, and what mechanism that you have to maintain the transparency of the select committee, and how powerful the select committee over the executive body? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. YB Siva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Andrews, for taking the time to come all the way from Australia to share your experiences with us. My question is about how a committee system could help us improve our scrutiny of our annual budgets. I'm not sure about the system there, but here in Malaysia, we are actually currently just about coming to the end of the longest parliamentary meeting of the year, the third meeting of the year, where budgets are the budget for next year is presented and approved in Parliament. The process of discussion currently, basically, what happens is we have a policy stage of discussion, which takes spread over 3 or 4 days, where perhaps about 60, 70 members of Parliament would stand up. They would speak on any aspect of it whatsoever for about 20 minutes. Some would only get 5 minutes. That happens over about 4 days. Then over the next few days, 3 days, 25 ministers representing each ministry will respond to whatever was raised. And after that, we go into a committee stage. And because we haven't developed a committee system yet, essentially the entire House is treated as a committee. And then we go into, we'll have the same, we go ministry by ministry, where members of Parliament then address specific items of expenditure and say their piece. And then you get a rebuttal process where, again, each ministry will respond. But in that system, basically, even at the policy stage, each ministry will probably get about 2 hours or so, 2-3 hours at the most, and the same likely about 2 hours again at the committee stage. And that is the process we have now. Can you just share with us how you do your process, and how we could improve scrutiny of the budget in a more detailed fashion? Because the problem we are facing now is basically that because the entire House is one committee, the time allocated is limited, and the ability to go into specific items of expenditure and also look at the budget as a whole in terms of numbers, scrutiny of numbers and so on is quite difficult. So how did Australia deal with that problem? Because I'm sure at some point in your history, you probably did the same thing. The entire House was one committee, and then you moved into a more advanced and sophisticated committee system. So how would you do it, or how could we move there? Thank you.
Thank you. YB Siva, yes.
My name is Sayuti from Parliament of Malaysia. I have 2 questions. Can you enlighten us further on how parliamentary research officer can assist committee system, especially in Australia, and how many research officers in each committee? Maybe you can share your experience on this. Thank you.
And if I may add, do each MPs allocated research officer or grants for research officer? Yeah, please.
Perhaps I can start with the last question first. In Australia, each member of Parliament is allocated 4 staff members. They can determine what those staff members do, but usually we have someone who is the administrator, the office manager. We usually have someone who looks after our diary, our travel, things like that. Then we often have a person who is a research/media person who does some research on speeches or reports you might be working on, but also helps with the media. And then we might have another person who just helps out in doing all sorts of things that need to be done in the office. So every member of Parliament in Australia, regardless of whether their party is in government or not, has that allocation of staff members, and it's up to each of us individually to determine what we want those 4 people to do within our offices. If you become a minister, then you get further staff as a minister. If you're a leader of a party, if you're the leader of the opposition, for example, the deputy leader of the opposition, there are further staff members allocated for those roles in addition to that. The parliamentary committees also have research people associated with them. And we have a parliamentary library, which I'm looking at, Catherine, I think we have about 60 or 70 researchers in the parliamentary library. So I, as a member of parliament, and I often do this, I would ask the parliamentary library to research for me some subject that I want answers to, or I want a report on a particular subject. And it's a very efficient service. And there's many researchers there, and they operate for whichever members of Parliament want some information or research done for them. So that's a resource which we have, every member of Parliament has access to. Then the committees have a secretariat, and the way the current organisation is that there is a secretariat which would service about 3 committees, and those secretariats would have perhaps 7, I'm looking at 7 to 10 staff. Most of them some would be administrative, so they're just making sure that the committee hearings can be organised, that that you book a room if you're going to some other city to hold hearings, the administrative things like that for the committee. But then there are people who do research on behalf of the committee for whatever the inquiry is that the committee is looking at. And they tend to be generalists in terms of research, but obviously develop some specialty and expertise in the matters which the committee is actually inquiring into. So that's a resource that we have in the Parliament as well, which is very valuable in terms of the committee work. The previous question about the estimates and the budget process, this is largely done in the Australian Parliament by the Senate Estimates Committees. So there is an Estimates Committee that covers each of the annual reports and budget of each of the government departments. It's not a committee of the whole, it's not all the members of the House, so people select which committee or committees they wish to be part of, and then after the budget each year there's a process for about 2 weeks, and then subsequently later in the year and again later past that, where the estimates committees question the minister and the senior public servants in relation to the items in the budget, and they can go through a budget item by item if they wish to, or they can take parts out of the budget. It depends on the particular interest of the members who are on the particular estimates committee as to the way in which they question the ministers and the senior public servants about the budget. So that's the process. It could be better in my observation, but I'm not a senator, so they might have a different view. But I think sometimes it does become a little bit politicised in the Senate, particularly if you're moving closer to an election. I think there could be more scrutiny than there actually is at the present time, but at least there is that degree of scrutiny 3 times a year in terms of the budget and the specific budget of the departments and each of the departments, and the programs which those departments administer are subject or can be subject to questioning by the Senate Estimates Committees. There's also the Public Accounts Committee, which usually carries out more in-depth inquiries into particular government agencies or statutory authorities in terms of the work which they undertake as well. But my advice would be, if you want to look at it further, then to look at the way in which the Senate Estimates Committees work in the Australian Parliament. The other question was about, and also I should say in relation to that, it's not, those Estimates Committee hearings go on for, after the budget, I think, for about 2 weeks. So, and each committee would spend up to a number of days on a particular department which it's actually looking at the budget for. So it's an in-depth process that occurs. And they can also put questions on notice to the ministers, which they have to respond to if they're not responding to them immediately when the hearing is underway. And those hearings are held in public as well and are televised, so people can watch what's going on in terms of the questions. And the media often use questions which are raised with departments to then publish stories about whether or not departments are expending money in the way in which they believe that they should be doing so for the benefit of the public. So there's a degree of scrutiny that goes into that process. The question about maintaining independence and transparency, I think it really comes back to what I said before. If the processes of the committees are held in public, then there is a degree of transparency in the process, and that in itself lends an accountability to the process which is occurring. But beyond that, as I said, no self-respecting chair of a parliamentary committee in Australia would be told what to do by a minister in relation to a particular matter before the committee. And as I said, I've been both a minister and a chair of a committee, and I regard, in both roles, I've regarded the role of the chair of the committee and the committee as independent from the executive. And I do that for a very practical reason, because I want the committee to do the best job it can, because that can help me as a minister to actually resolve problems and find a way to have solutions to what may be an otherwise difficult situation that could face the government. So it actually is in the long-term interests of the minister and the executive to have committees come to an agreed response about problems. It makes it easier then to implement that as the government of the day.
Yes, my former boss at UIA.
Thank you. See how obedient my deputy speaker. Now, I would like to bring up one specific select committee that has been established in many state assemblies or even in parliament. For example, in Selangor, even in Malacca, we have established one select committee on competence, accountability, and transparency. Since this committee is a parliamentary committee set up by government, so members are mainly parliamentarians. We have, say, state financial officer become ex officio. Now, the term of reference for this particular select committee is to have investigation on any issue, abuse of power, corruption, that sort of thing that happened in the state. Now, with the view to improve the system so that such a thing will not happen, but it is not empowered to take action against those that have caused trouble in there. Now, my question is, such a committee, can Parliament or the Assembly give the authority to the members to take action on the assemblymen or members of Parliament who are found guilty of such offence, or rather just to bring up the recommendation for the betterment of the system in the state, because I come from the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Datuk. Yes, deputies. So from the Speaker of Malacca to the Deputy Speaker of the Federal Parliament.
Thank you for giving the chance also to post some ideas or question here. I have visited the Canberra House of Representatives, also the Senate. There's a little, there is a little bit of difference where you have another chamber, they call it Federation Chamber. So it's compared with the rest of the audiences here. Kita ada satu chamber sini, kamar khas, they call it. But over there is a Federation Chamber. And apart from the speaker and deputy speakers, you also have a panel of speakers, about 10 of them, who can rotate and can sit on this Federation Chamber. It's just to reconfirm on that. Then with regards to where the subcommittees, after they have already concluded, we have viewed, one of the occasions where they're given 10 minutes to the committee to present in the Federation Chamber then is that all, or they have to present it over to the main house? And the portion of it is the scope of the the select committee. There is it can be a tremendous job to do that. And I was informed at that particular time that each of them has got some allowances. Maybe certain percentage of the main basic allowances. They are also, I think, about 10-20%. The chairman of the committee, the select committee. Can you confirm on that? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes. Yes, Webi. And then our young man here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Wabi Datuk Saifuddin. I really appreciate how the inquiries and hearings are live. I'm a state assemblyman from Selangor, and I wanted to ask the Honourable, how did you achieve that mindset change, into making all this information public and easily accessible? So, for example, I just went onto the Australian Parliament website, and I could track down all the hearings and audio and videos of the select committees. And I contrast that to our parliament, where if you pull up the select committees, all you see are the names of the committee members. So how did Australia achieve that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Saudara.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Sir Kevin and YB. I'm Irwan from UiTM Postgraduate Society. Here I believe in liberal democratic value for political change and with political freedom, free and fair trade, with minimal intervention, and freedom of speech, freedom of disagree, and how Australia overcome fundamentalism and political conservatism and socialism, since liberalism so taboo and very skeptical in towards each other in Malaysia society.
Okay, the gentleman at the back, yeah.
Thank you, Datuk Saifuddin. Okay, my name is Hadi from Parliament. So I have two questions. My first question, how do you prioritize evidence, the evidence? So there are two types of evidence, the written evidence and the oral evidence. So who analyzed the evidence, whether the secretariat or is it the members of the committee? My first question. My second question with regards of the Parliamentary Select Committee proceeding broadcasting, which is my friends over there already touched. So I would like to know which one is better, whether you make the general clause provision, general provisions in the standing order, which allows every proceedings need to be broadcasting, or you make exception to the general rule, or you disallow any proceedings, but later on you can ask for permission from the Select Committee to allow broadcasting. Thank you.
Okay, we are about to round up, so if I may collect one more question, Saifuddin.
Thank you, Dato'. My name is Saifuddin from Institute of Raisan, the co-organizer for the program today. I'm quite impressed to hear how generous your parliament has been assisting the parliamentarian in the form of providing research assistance and media people. The only question is how are these people grouped together in the service? Are they part of the government servants, or they have different services for the parliament? Because there's an issue here. If we provide the services to the parliamentarian from the government servant, then these people are loyal to the executive rather than to the parliamentarian. I think in the context of our parliament here, I believe most of them are, almost all of them are government servants, except for the secretary of the Dewan Rakyat receiving appointment from the king. The rest is just pure government servant coming from the public services department. How do you deal with this group of people?
Okay, any other burning questions you can? Yeah, I saw there were two online. There were two questions from the Slido. One is, how do you ensure that Parliament is not just a rubber stamp? There was another question earlier on, something to that effect. Okay, I can have one last one, yeah.
Good afternoon, the Honourable. My name is Musana from IAIS Malaysia. My question is about, you mentioned about
where recommendations made like 20 years back regarding the eligibility of your member of parliament regarding the citizenship. So my question is how do we ensure, but it's not really appropriate to ensure the recommendations made by the select committee to be taken up by the government, but how effective or how efficient the work done by the select committee so that all the hard works not been taken for granted by the government, so to avoid the things happen in Australia. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the question about the ability of the Parliament or parliamentary committees to penalise someone who has been found to have acted inappropriately, I think was the nub of your question. Our parliamentary committees don't generally have that power. The Privileges Committee could find an individual in contempt of Parliament, and indeed under our standing orders the Parliament could penalise a person and indeed imprison someone. The last time that happened in Australia, I think, was in the early 1950s, and I can't imagine it ever happening again, at least in my lifetime. And it could also even lead to the disqualification of a person sitting in Parliament, which happened once in Australia at the time of the First World War, and I can't imagine that that would ever happen again. So I don't think in the Australian Parliament there would be any appetite whatsoever for the Parliament itself to become effectively a judge and jury of its own members in the sort of circumstances that you talk about. We have in some states of Australia anti-corruption commissions. That varies from state to state as to whether they exist and what their powers are, but generally those anti-corruption commissions don't themselves have the ability to penalise a person. They can inquire into a matter, they can expose corruption, and they can pass a case effectively to the public prosecutors, who would have to then bring an action, a criminal action in court against people in those circumstances. So I don't see that we would ever, as I said, I don't think in my lifetime we would ever go in the direction of allowing the Parliament itself to have that sort of power. Deputy Speaker, the question of the Federation Chamber. The Federation Chamber is relatively new. It's been operating for probably about a decade now, Catherine. Yes, thank you. Catherine Cornish is one of the senior officers of the Australian Parliament, and I'll come back to her in a moment in relation to another question that we had about the role of staff in the Parliament. But the Federation Chamber has been operating for about 10 years. It's a parallel chamber. It's much smaller than the House of Representatives, so I think I was in the chair, which I'll come to part of your question in a moment, and I counted 36 seats in the Federation Chamber. Last time I was actually one of the acting deputy chairs in the chamber. The sort of things that are debated in the Federation Chamber are firstly uncontentious legislation. If there's a bill that's going to go through the Parliament which everybody agrees to but people still want to speak on, there's not going to be a vote, it's not going to be a division, then those bills often are referred to the Federation Chamber, and it provides more time for the Parliament to meet because the Federation Chamber is generally operating at the same time that the House itself is operating, unless there's a division in the House, in which case the Federation Chamber ceases to operate. It suspends until the division in the House is over, so we can all go to the House to vote. So it deals with uncontentious legislation. It also discusses what we call private members' business, which means every member of the House who's not a minister is referred to in our standing orders as a private member, and all of us are entitled to put a motion on the paper and have it debated. We're entitled to move a bill and have it debated, but those bills generally are not voted upon, the private members' bills, unless the government of the day allows a vote to occur. And I think in almost 20 years, only about 20 private members' bills have ever passed the House. So it's not common to actually vote on them, but it is quite common to have that bill there for discussion and people to have a debate about the particular bill. And then the other major area in which there is discussion in the Federation Chamber is actually the committee reports. So as a chair, when I'm tabling a report, I table it in the House of Representatives. I would speak to it for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. The deputy chair from the opposition, if he or she wishes to speak to it, they can speak to it for 5 or 10 minutes in the main chamber, and then that report is referred to the Federation Chamber, and if many other members who want to speak to it then can speak to that committee report in the Federation Chamber. So that's been actually a very useful part of the evolution of the Parliament, to provide more opportunities for members to speak on more subjects than occurred in the past. You raised the and governments have to respond to committee reports, and those responses are in writing. And to come to the person who raised the question of going onto the parliamentary website, if you go onto a parliamentary committee website where a report is on the website, so you can read the report on the website, and you can also read the government response to the report on the website as well. In the House, the government has to respond within 6 months, and in the Senate within 3 months of the report being tabled. Personally, I prefer it was 3 months for both houses, but it's 6 months in the House, and generally the government does respond. If not, then the Speaker, a member can ask the Speaker why the government hasn't responded, and at the beginning of a Parliament, a Procedures Committee can also look at whether the responses have been given by the government. But generally, the government does respond in a fairly timely manner to parliamentary reports, not only whether they agree or disagree with the recommendation, but the reasons also as to why they would agree or disagree. And in most cases, the majority of recommendations from a parliamentary committee are agreed to in whole or at least partially. There's not many recommendations of parliamentary committees that are not agreed to by the government of the day. The chairs of committees do get paid. They get a bonus for being chair of the committee, and the deputy chair gets a payment as well, as my recollection. Yes, I haven't been a deputy chair for a while, but deputy chair gets an additional payment as well, and that's to recompense for the additional time, because as a chair of a committee, there is a lot of additional work as the chair of the committee, and that includes working on the drafting of the report. There was a question about that from someone. Usually reports are what happens at the end of an inquiry or during the inquiry. The members of the committee will have a discussion about what they want to see in the report, and have a discussion about the recommendations they would like to see made. Usually the Secretariat and the researchers' offices in the Secretariat go and provide a first draft of that. The chair of the committee then goes through that draft and looks at it, and then it's sent out to all the members of the committee, and then the committee will meet as long as it's needed to actually resolve the report. And again, as I said, that is a consensus building exercise in almost every case, to ensure that there's a unanimous report from the committee and unanimous recommendations. A panel of speakers, yes. So in addition to having a speaker, a deputy speaker, and we actually have a second deputy speaker, so there's effectively 2 deputy speakers, there is a panel of members of Parliament who act as the speaker when the speaker's not in the chair. So I'm on that panel at the present time, so probably for about 3, 4, maybe 5 hours of the week, I'm actually sitting in the chair, chairing either the House of Representatives itself or the Federation Chamber. We take it in turns to do that, and we chair for an hour at a time, and then someone else comes in. The Speaker always chairs question time. The Speaker invariably chairs if there's any major debate. If there was a censure motion, for example, in the government, the Speaker would chair that. The Speaker generally chairs the adjournment debate at the end of the day, but otherwise either the deputy speakers or members of the panel of speakers fill in for the Speaker during that period of time. There was a question about how do you make public. Could someone remind me what, my notes are not very good. If the questioner can, yes.
Which one is better, whether you make a general provisions with regard of the...
Yes.
Yeah.
So generally, committees have both private hearings and public hearings. Sometimes we get briefings which are private, and for good reason you want them to be private. For example, I'm on the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee. If we're having a briefing from the senior leadership of the Australian Defence Forces, we would usually prefer that to be a private hearing, because we want them to tell us more than they would be able to tell us if it was a public hearing. Sometimes even for intelligence, for example, hearings in relation to intelligence matters would be private hearings, because you want the intelligence agencies to actually be candid with the committee about the issues that are being discussed. But even on the National Disability Committee, sometimes we have private discussions with the National Disability Agency, because we want them to be candid about things which they might not want to be candid so much in public about things. But having said that, most of the hearings are public hearings. Therefore, most can be broadcast if the facilities are there to broadcast them. But there's a provision that if the committee wishes to, or a witness in a hearing would like to give evidence in private, in camera, then the committee can go into camera, or the committee can hear an application, a request from a person who's discussing a matter with the committee to have it held in camera. And if the committee agrees to hold it in camera, well, then it would be held in camera. But that's the exception rather than the rule. The general rule is a public hearing is a public hearing. Any member of the public can wander in and listen to what's going on. The media can be there and report upon it. It can be broadcast if it happens to be on the broadcast channel that day for that particular hearing. So they are held openly like that, and I think the advantage of that is that it aids the transparency and accountability of the committee process in a way that you wouldn't otherwise get it. There was a question about prioritising evidence, I think. Was that the question? How do you do that? Look, if you read my suggestion is look at any report of a House committee and read a couple of chapters of it, and what you'll find is that the report tends to set out the evidence that's been provided to the committee. So it'll say that this organisation said this organisation said that, this person said this other person said that, and it's all summarised there in the report. And then towards the end of the chapter there'll be a part where it has what the committee's view about this is, and the committee then, a bit like a judge would in a court, draw conclusions from the evidence which has been set out as fairly as we can, the committee's conclusions about the evidence before it and what needs to be done, and then that would usually be followed by, if there was a proposal to do this, some recommendations as to what the committee is proposing should be done to address the issue before it. So it's not so much prioritising the evidence, it's more a matter of presenting the evidence as fairly as you can, so it's all there on the record. The other reason why that's important is because if you invite people to come before a parliamentary committee, you want them to feel valued. You want them to feel that they've been listened to and they've been heard and their ideas have been taken into consideration, even if at the end of the day the committee doesn't agree with particular ideas that have been put before it. At least there is a respectful process of consultation and listening by the committee, and that's the way in which it tends to be done. And then there was a question about research. The researchers, the Secretariat and the staff of the parliamentary committees are employed by the Parliament itself. They are not public servants that are in the Department of Finance last year and the parliamentary committee this year. They are people who generally remain dedicated to work as members of secretariats within the Parliament, and that's why I mentioned Catherine, who's been a long-term member of the parliamentary service. They do a number of roles, including the clerking roles within the House, and people work through that process and gain senior appointments, and usually the Clerk of the House, for example, comes through that process. But it is a dedicated group of people whose work is for the Parliament itself rather than the government. They are solely employed by the Parliament. Now, from time to time, you might second someone from a department to work on a particular inquiry, but it's well understood that whilst that person is working on the committee inquiry, they are working for the committee. They are not to report back to their department what's happening in the inquiry. They are bound by the rules of confidentiality whilst they're working for that committee. But usually someone like that would be chosen and seconded because they have expertise in a particular area which the committee doesn't have, and for a period of usually 2 or 3 months, it's not a long period of time, they come to the committee to work on the committee's business at that time. But it's strictly separate from any work that they would have done within the department, and as I said, they are bound to maintain the confidentiality of the committee process in that. So it is very independent of the government in terms of the people who work on the committee. How do you... Was there any other questions? I can't read my own writing now. Did I miss one? Yes, sir.
How do you ensure the efficiency or the effectiveness of the select committee work recommendations to the government?
Look, in part I've answered that, and that is that the reports are published. The government has to respond to the reports. The reasons for their response to the recommendations are set out by the government, and my experience is that the great majority of parliamentary committee recommendations are actually adopted by the government. And that again comes from the fact that these are consensus bipartisan recommendations, which are usually practical solutions to problems facing the nation, and it doesn't matter too much who's in government because that's a problem facing the nation which has to be resolved by whoever's in government, and there's that attitude that if the committees work in that way, then their work is valuable and will be taken up by the government. It doesn't mean that everything that a parliamentary committee ever recommends is adopted by the government, but the majority of recommendations are adopted and at least implemented in part by the government, and that's the way the system has largely evolved in Australia.
Datuk, this is a very crucial, if you may allow me, sorry. Very crucial to that staffing issues. How do you finance the operation of the parliament itself? Because the irony here is the parliament has to go back to the executive to get the funding, and the executive decide how to use the money and get it approved by the executive. How does it?
Well, the Department of the House of Representatives, the Department of the Senate and the Parliament itself has a budget, and that's a budget which is approved by the Finance Department and the Finance Minister, just as the budgets of other government departments are approved. And the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate and their respective officers would put forward a draft budget in the budget process each year for the running of the Parliament. And whilst they might sometimes want more than they get, I can't recall any occasion in which they've got less than they've had received in the past. So there's a understanding across the political spectrum that the functioning of the Parliament is important, and that the conduct of the committees, the conduct of the House, the Senate, etc., has to be paid for, and that's just a normal budget process which occurs. But it's not been a matter of any great controversy in Australia that the funding of the Parliament and the parliamentary departments has to be maintained. So that's the way it's done in the normal process. And indeed, for that matter, a Senate Estimates Committee could question the Speaker or not the Speaker because he's not in the Senate, but he could question the President or officers of the Senate about their budget, just as they could question the Minister and his or her public servants about the functioning of a departmental budget. It's a normal process that applies to that, although there's not too much questioning of the budget of the parliamentary departments, because there's a recognition across the political spectrum that this is an important commitment that we've made to ensuring that the Parliament operates as best it can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Honourable Mr. Kevin. If I may, Saifuddin, I think, I'm not sure if this was discussed earlier, but in our context, I think the first thing that we have to look at is the possibility of reintroducing the Parliamentary Services Act of 1963, where you have a separate parliamentary service, and then you have the Dewan Negara President and the Dewan Rakyat Speaker jointly appointed as the jointly appointed members of the parliamentary service. This is something that I know my friend, the former Deputy Speaker of Dewan Rakyat, Dr. Wan Junaidi, is one of his passion, He may want to touch this in his next presentation, I don't know. But brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big hand to show our appreciation to Honorable Kevin.
I would like to thank both the presenter, the Honorable Kevin Andrews, and moderator, Honorable Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, for successfully delivering a very informative session this afternoon. I would like also to invite Yang Berhormat Datuk Haji Muhammad Rashid bin Hasnun, Deputy Speaker of the Dewan Rakyat, to give a token of appreciation to both speaker and moderator for the session. Terima kasih. Sedikit pengumuman. Untuk makluman, minum petang disediakan di lobi Dewan sepanjang program berlangsung.